So the topic of the talk tonight takes place in Cleveland proper and not Cleveland Heights, but it's interesting to think that maybe one of the reasons why Millionaires Row started to decline was due to the fact that the millionaires found it attractive to move to suburbs like Cleveland Heights and Shaker Heights. So while Cleveland Heights isn't really directly involved in this story, just remember that it plays a small part in the whole narrative here. So with that, let me introduce tonight's speaker, Dan Raminsky. He began his career as a high school social studies teacher before entering private business. He's now known as the Cleveland Storyteller for his one-of-a-kind talks on the history of Cleveland. In his role as the Cleveland Storyteller, he's also involved in fundraising for the Willoughby Rotary Autism Project, which provides iPads to individuals with autism to enhance communication and learn new skills. It sounds like a really neat project. Mr. Raminsky is also the author of Cleveland in the Gilded Age, A Stroll Down Millionaires Row, as well as the DVD, The Great Estates of Wycliffe, both of which over there, and I'm sure you could purchase after the talk. So please welcome Dan Raminsky.
Thank you. All set? Hello. Good. Well, thank you so much. I'm pleased to be here. Basically, it's the first time at Cleveland Heights Library, so it's indeed a pleasure. And I always run into some folks that have come to a talk before, and I'm thrilled to death that they thought enough to come back a second time. I've become, over the years, known as Cleveland Storyteller, Dan Raminsky, and last year we did 140 presentations. And I present with the idea of promoting Cleveland, Ohio. Hopefully tonight when you leave, and I know we're all proud of Cleveland, and when I say Cleveland, I mean the greater Cleveland area. But tonight, hopefully you'll be a little more proud when we understand the great history that took place and some of the cast of characters that I think you'll know about. And so that's my mission, and we've had good success. And at the end of the talk, I'm going to give you some answers to those stereotypes. And if you're like me, I don't mention them. I don't define them because they're so offensive on so many fronts. As all of us know, this greater Cleveland area is just a marvelous place to live and to raise a family. Over the 6 years, I've enjoyed many questions from my audience. And I've enjoyed a question that occurs every time, and it has nothing to do with history, oddly enough. And that is, how tall are you? And I am 6'6". It wasn't by choice. And I'm holding, and I've enjoyed it over the years. And of course, the follow-up question, did you play basketball? And indeed I did. At Orange High School, we used to play Cleveland Heights. And then I went to John Carroll University, and I played semi-professional for the United States Army for 1 year. Being so tall, I think sometimes it's intimidating. I also think it's uncomfortable if you have to stretch and look up here. So this chair is with purpose, as I'm going to sit down, my vision of where a storyteller should be, and hopefully tell you a most enlightening, enjoyable story. If I said to you, Cleveland, Ohio, the wealthiest, greatest city in the world, I think your comeback might be, Dan, what Cleveland are you talking about? And I'm talking about Cleveland, Ohio, about 1885. Cleveland permeated every aspect of society worldwide. We were that famous, and that kind of thing makes you famous. We were known as the wealthiest city in the world. And I've had people question me on that. You know, Dan, where did you read that? I've heard Cleveland was quite something, but the wealthiest city in all the world is quite a statement. And my answer is that, and it is in print in several publications, that over 60% of the world's millionaires lived in Cleveland, Ohio at one time. 60%. Now, by anybody's definition, that makes you the wealthiest city in all the world. And if you extrapolate, as I sometimes daydream and say, let's take today's billionaires, and let's put half the world's billionaires in a city. We can only imagine how vibrant, how famous, how employed that city would be, how creative. And then we go backwards to 1885. That was our Cleveland, Ohio. We not only were the greatest and the wealthiest, but we had the premier street in all the world, Euclid Avenue, Millionaires Row. And if you want to have fun, drive from about East 9th down to the clinic and visualize mansion after mansion after mansion. 200 at any given time. Over the years that the avenue was in existence, over 350 families resided on Euclid Avenue. And it was a genuine neighborhood. There were 14 churches that were architecturally mixed in, and people did not mind living right next door to a church because it was a shorter distance to go. The streets were busy, and one of the things that wasn't stressed is that many of these national characters that lived on Euclid Avenue were like rock stars. People just wanted to get a glimpse. And if you're like me, I remember when I was a little kid driving the Rapid downtown, and the mansions along Shaker were lit up, and you always wondered, who lived there? And sometimes a guy would come out in his bathrobe and pick up the newspaper. And I would say, well, now I know. But you just wanted a glimpse. And of course, the mansions on Euclid Avenue were much bigger than the ones in Cleveland Heights and Shaker. They were premier. If you've been following that wonderful TV series, Downton Abbey, that mansion's about 65,000 square feet. And many on Euclid Avenue approach 50,000 square feet. Downton Abbey, again, if you follow it, has about 24 servants. And it's the interplay with the servants is what makes it so attractive. Largest house on Euclid Avenue was built by Sam Andrews, founder of Standard Oil. And if you'd like to see it, it's no longer there, but we can at least tell you where it was. It was on the corner of Euclid and 30th Street. And Channel 5 is there today. And it was on 6 acres. It was on a hill. It's hard to imagine, but there was a great hill there, and they could see Lake Erie from their backyard. Andrews built it in 1882 and moved in with the idea of entertaining Queen Victoria, as he was from England, along with his wife. And they built a solid black ivory bedroom upstairs so that the Queen would have the absolute perfect location. Sadly, the Queen never showed up. The Andrews got disgusted because they couldn't maintain the house. It had over 100 rooms. And they couldn't heat it, they couldn't maintain it. But if you remember, we said Downton Abbey was 24 servants. That house took 100 servants. And it was built at a cost of $1 million in 1882, so you can imagine. It was known as Andrews Folly. Andrews never returned, lived there 2 years and vacated. The son, Horace, lived there for a time, but then he could maintain it, and it sat vacant. Now, they left a skeleton crew there, some maids and some people that take care of the yard, to keep up the neighborhood, more or less, and so you'd never know that nobody was living there. But indeed, they were gone, never to return. Eventually, it was torn down, stone by stone by stone, and imploded into the basement. And the sad part of that story is all the furniture and the rugs from Great Britain were all rotting on the floors. So that was the sad part of our story. Now, I said to you that Euclid Avenue was called the grandest, most beautiful street in all the world. And again, I get questioned, well, Dan, is that not exaggerated? And I said, no, it's not, actually. And the fact is that I didn't say that. A fellow that you may know said that, and that was Mark Twain. Mark Twain called Euclid Avenue, our Euclid Avenue, the grandest, most beautiful street in all the world. Now, I took history as you did. I taught history. Nobody taught me about Mark Twain being in Cleveland. And he hung around with several families on the avenue, lived on the avenue for a while, and traveled with the families to Europe, both on missionary and on pleasure, and wrote a book about this, which very few people know about. And so he knew Euclid Avenue very well. He also knew all the other cities that had famous streets, like New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, or London, or Paris, or even Moscow. And he chose to call our Euclid Avenue the grandest, most beautiful street in all the world. By the way, the family that he hung around with most, you would know as well, and that was the Severance family. So if you've been to Severance Hall, it's one of the same, and they were 3 brothers, and they all had mansions on Euclid Avenue. One of the brothers made his fortune through John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil. So you're starting to get the idea of this Cleveland and how great it was. Now, I could sit here and probably give you a boring history lesson in terms of the greatness of Cleveland, but I'd rather tell you some stories that'll indicate how great we are. And back in 1875, Cleveland was already becoming the hub of the entertainment industry. Today, it's wonderful to see what's going on. We're number 2 behind New York, and I think in many senses we're better than New York. And of course, you've all read about the new chandelier that was absolutely marvelous for our theater district. So back in 1875, they were going to build the premier opera house in the United States. And the plane dealer was mocking this project, and you might ask, well, why would they do this? They're going to build privately the grandest, most beautiful opera house in the United States. And it was going to be located on Euclid and East 4th Street. Well, the newspapers were mocking it because they said it would never fly, it would never be popular. And again, you might ask why. Well, because they thought it was too far out in the country. Now, I can't say they were farming on East 4th Street, but it was a residential, sparsely populated area. And the entrance came off Euclid, and it also came off East 4th. They built a solid marble tunnel that took into the theater, and of course you can picture the marvelous coaches with these famous horses dropping people off to go to the opera. Many people appeared at the Opera House, some of which you'll recognize. The Barrymore family, if you recognize that name, which are still around today, Drew Barrymore. There was a beautiful actress when I was growing up, Rita Hayworth, you may remember. Her grandfather appeared at the East 4th Opera House. And the founder of the East 4th Opera House actually early on palled around with a fella that you also might recognize, John Wilkes Booth, who assassinated Abraham Lincoln. But he was a thespian, if you remember, so Lincoln being killed in a theater all kind of tragically fit together. Now, John Barrymore also appeared at the old Cleveland Playhouse, which is located next to the Cleveland Clinic as they consolidated downtown. Many of us loved that playhouse and would hope it would be renovated. I don't know. I think the clinic will not tear it down because of historical value, but the theaters were wonderful, and you may have been in the Drury Theater. Francis Drury founded the theater and donated the land. And his mansion was across the street on East 86th Street, built in 1910, and it's still there today. The clinic calls it Foundation House, and they spent $6 million to preserve it. So the clinic gets accused of ripping everything down, but there are 4 mansions of any significance left. The clinic owns 2, and they spent $6 million to save them. So the clinic does do some very positive things in that vein. Well, at any rate, in saving the mansion, they basically endeared Francis Drury to us for life. At the Playhouse, Barrymore was appearing one day, and he was in a play. The title, I believe, was The Bards of Richard. Now, if that doesn't ring a bell, you might recognize a famous phrase in that play. King Richard is in battle, and his horse gets killed from underneath him. And he said, my kingdom for a horse. Now, Barrymore is about to deliver that line. And the acoustics in that theater are absolutely perfect. It's a small, little theater. And just before he delivered that line, a big fella in the front row let out a large belch. And the audience obviously began to snicker. Now, Barrymore's about to deliver the premiere line of the play, and the audience is snickering. He lost control to no fault of his own. And he casually, as the professional that he was, and I think this gives you some insight into how professional he actually was, he stepped back and waited for the audience to recompose themselves. And then he changed the famous line to fit the situation. And the line, I think, shows you how quick he was on his feet. And what he changed from my kingdom for a horse, he changed it to get a saddle for that horse's ass.
Wow.
Wasn't that clever? Now, intermission at the opera, women would be served chocolate. And chocolate in the winter probably was fine. And of course, the women were totally dressed with gloves and hats. And if you've ever had experience trying to eat melted chocolate and still trying to stay neat, it's quite a chore. The men, by the way, didn't eat chocolate. They went to the bar. And I think no matter how much history I read, some things just don't change. At any rate, there was a young candy maker, and he may have observed this, and he had a better idea. And he migrated from Garrettsville, Ohio, through Chagrin Falls, out where I live these days, and into Cleveland. And he thought a hard candy would solve this problem, and indeed it was, a candy that was immune to the weather. And so he invented it, and it became very popular. So popular that you're still eating his candy today. And I'll give you a hint. It has a hole in the middle. Lifesavers. What you may not know about Lifesavers, the hole was intentional. As for if a child swallowed the candy, they could still breathe. So it was an engineered candy. Now, I've read this time and again, and believe me, I don't have the nerve to try it, but that's what was written up about the candy. And Clarence enjoyed great success, And there was a fellow up in New York by the name of Ed Noble, and he was in the pre-internet business in 1908. And I bet nobody talked about the pre-internet business. You've probably never heard of this, especially not in 1908. He was in the postcard business. And postcards, in part, made Cleveland very famous. The internet gets the word out. Postcards got the word out about Cleveland. And people as far away as Moscow came in and painted the mansions to be reproduced on postcards, and then advertising on the back. And that is part of the reason that Cleveland became a world-renowned known entity. So Ed was in that business. He heard about the candy, and he came to Cleveland to sell Clarence some advertising. And that would have worked wonderfully, except he made a big mistake. He tasted the candy. And he loved it so much, he bought the company for a whopping $3,900. Now, Clarence thought he had a pretty good deal because in 1908, of course, you could buy a home. But all things being said, it probably was a better deal for Ed Noble. Ed obviously did a marvelous job because Lifesavers today, I think we'd agree, is in the top 10 brands in the world over 100 years later. So what a marvelous kind of business to be created in Cleveland, Ohio. But Ed wasn't done. He took his business to New York, and through the Great Depression, he was able to save $39 million from a little candy with a hole in the middle. And he decided to buy another little company, and that company you may have come in contact with today and not known any of this story. And that company was ABC, American Broadcasting Company. So you kind of see how greatness grows. And once you get on track with greatness, it grows and grows. A little candy. Who would have thought that it would lead to that end situation? Now, Cleveland was famous also because we were the start of the automobile industry. We had over 30 manufacturers of great automobiles. Early on in 1905, the White Sewing Machine Company was building automobiles. So if you bought a sewing machine, you could also buy an automobile from the same company. And the Whites were very shrewd because women bought sewing machines, and so they designed a car specifically for women. That was their audience, their customer, as early as 1905. All done here in Cleveland, Ohio. And then, of course, we started losing that business. Now, Cleveland had various makes and models. The three famous, one was Baker Electric, an all-electric car that came out in 1898. And it got 40 miles per charge. General Motors just came out with an electric vehicle. 5 years ago, it got 40 miles per charge. What's wrong with this picture? Baker Electric, it was said, if it ran out of juice, you parked it. There was some magic in the battery that recharged it. The chauffeur would go down the next day and drive it home and put it in the garage. Second car was a Winton, built by Alexander Winton, who had the largest automobile plant in the world, right here in Cleveland, Ohio. Produced the first gasoline-powered car in 1898 and developed the V8 engine. And by the way, early on, these cars were programmed to go 85 miles an hour. And of course, they raced horses to show that the automobile was more reliable than the horse. Many drivers got hurt in this process as there was no safety going on. You may remember a famous driver of my generation by the name of Barney Oldfield. He was the premier driver of the day and raced against the White Motor Company. It was interesting because I hadn't heard that name for many years when my dad got me my driver's license, and oftentimes when I went a little too fast, he said, "Who do you think you are, Barney Oldfield?" Little did he know I didn't know who Barney Oldfield was. But thank you, Dad. I know today who Barney Oldfield is, and I understand what you were trying to say. So at any rate, Alexander Winton, his partner came up to him one day, and he wanted him to interview a bright young mechanic. And obviously, being the largest auto plant in the world, they needed bright young mechanics. And after the interview, the partner went up to Alexander Winton and said, "Well, what do you think? Are we going to hire the fellow?" And Alexander said, "No, he's not good enough for our company. We're not going to hire him." That fellow was Henry Ford. Henry Ford got a lot of background in Cleveland, Ohio. Nothing escaped Cleveland's greatness. Many years later, when Henry Ford was a great success, and you may remember this from your history, Henry Ford's grandson married Harvey Firestone Jr.'s daughter. And they brought in 7 Lincoln limousines from Detroit for the wedding. And you can imagine, these were perfect specimens. And they were very carefully parked in the Firestone corporate garages. And as they were readying them for the wedding, one of the workers noticed that they were on Goodyear tires. And he went to Harvey Firestone Jr. and he said, "Sir, do you realize that the Fords came in on Goodyear tires. And Firestone's quote was, "I'll be damned," he said, "gee damned, that my daughter will be married on those tires. You change them all out to Firestone." And indeed they were, and I don't know that the Fords knew any different. Now, later on, in modern time, there was an executive at Ford that tried to sever the relationship between Ford and Firestone, or at least diminish it. And he was fired. And again, we don't think history is valuable. Had he read his history, he might have known. That's a tie in blood. That's marriage. You don't monkey with that relationship. And obviously, he didn't know about the story. But they all did have a sense of humor. And the last car was my favorite, and it was Whistling Willie, built by the White Sewing Machine Company. And how would you like to have a car today that you pull in your garage, pull out your hose, and fill it up? Well, that's what the white car was. It was a steam car with a gasoline backup. And it was a big touring car. It sold for $3,000. It would have been chauffeur-driven. We have a couple of them down at the Western Reserve Historical, the Auto Museum. And it got over 25 miles per gallon, this big car that weighed about 3 tons. And they sold thousands and thousands of these. So the technology early on was amazing compared to the technology that we're doing today, at least in the arena of economy. We have, of course, electronics and a lot of things that they didn't. But in the arena of economy and backing off from petroleum, all the technology was there and was tested and tested and tested. Now, next I'd like to take in a little trip, and this will be fun because you don't have to even leave your seat. And we're going to go up to the Smithsonian. And you may ask at this point, well, Dan, you're supposed to be talking about Cleveland history. Why are we going to the Smithsonian? Well, we're going to visit a plane up there. It was known as the Spirit of St. Louis. Charles Lindbergh, you may remember from your history. And again, you may ask, well, Dan, why are we visiting this plane? It has nothing to do with Cleveland. Oh, not so. Not so. You see the paint job on that plane? Sherwin-Williams, Cleveland, Ohio. You look in the cockpit, you see tubes and gauges allowing Lindbergh to transfer fuel from one tank to another. A little Cleveland company called Parker Appliance. Parker Hannafin today. If you look at the motor mounts that held the engine in place, Park Drop Forge, a little Cleveland company, a subsidiary of the White Motor Company, still around today. And the engine had valves, and the valves were hollowed out, and they were filled with sodium so that they would work flawlessly. 3,000 hours went into testing before those valves went into that plane. And again, in history, and I was a history teacher, nobody talked about the plane. They talked about Lindbergh and the great feat, but he needed a plane. And those valves were created by a little company called Thompson Products, TRW, as you know it. And Lindbergh came back to Cleveland many times. There's a road called River Road, and you may have driven that between Gates Mills and Hunting Valley. And there was an airstrip there that Lindbergh landed on 4 or 5 on occasions. And he came back to visit his friend, Myron T. Herrick, former governor of Ohio. But more importantly, Myron T. Herrick became ambassador from the United States to France, and he greeted Lindbergh when he landed. And if you remember, Lindbergh was very shy, and Myron T. Herrick took him under his wing and protected him, and they became great friends. When Herrick died, he had a state funeral in Cleveland, and Lindbergh flew in for that funeral, as they became very, very good friends. I have a picture where they took the wings off the plane at night so they could get it into the barn. This was Lindbergh's era. But that's history that we can feel and touch, and yet nobody knows about this stuff. Now, one of the things that fascinated me is all these privileged families on Euclid Avenue, and a lot of them started out very poor, but by the time they had children, the children were raised in the most privileged situations possible. And they tended to migrate among themselves, although many of the peaks, like the Whites, made their children work right in the plant next to workers. But by and large, the children were isolated and had the best of everything at their beck and call. And I wondered, what was the chore of parenting? How did you deal with children that would be motivated, that would go out and be kind to other people and would create something and do good for society like their parents did? And I came across a couple of examples. They're diametrically opposed. The one that I love is a fellow by the name of Thomas Howard White. And Thomas Howard White created the White Sewing Machine Company. They were number 2. They never overtook Singer, but they were the number 2 in the world. He was raised in New England. His parents were in the manufacturing business. They manufactured furniture. And Thomas Howard was fascinated early on with mechanical devices, including the sewing machine. And the early sewing machine was like a stapler. It was a handheld model. Later on, and I'm sure every one of your families had a white sewing machine at one time, it came in beautiful cabinetry. And it looked like a piece of furniture, and that was all done intentionally by the whites. So everything they did had to be perfect. And Thomas Howard, being raised into manufacturing, wanted to go to manufacturing for himself. He was making all of $25 a month working in his parents' factory. And he needed to save approximately $300 to go into business for himself. He got another job, and he made a little bit more money, but you can imagine making even $30 a month, how long he had to save to get to $300 and still cover his expenses. Well, eventually, over the years, he saved his $300, and now he's going into business for himself, or at least it appears. And no, he needed to raise some more money. And you might say, well, Dan, you just contradicted yourself. You said he only needed $300. What was the extra money for? Well, there was a New England tradition, I think, based in religion, and it basically said that before he left home to go out on his own, he had to repay his parents in some fashion for all the wonderful things they did for him. And he was going to give them money. Now, I read this, and I'm a parent of 4 of those little rascals. And I thought this was great. I called them all in, and I told them the story. I put it in my book, and I underlined the book, and I gave them the book, so they're well aware. Mom and I are still waiting for the check. Thomas Howard eventually did go into business and migrated to Cleveland because this was the place to be. Initially, he lived on Public Square, and there were 500 homes around Public Square, 500 buildings they tore down to build the Terminal Tower in the late 1920s. But Thomas Howard, like a lot of people that were successful, wanted to be on the premier street, and so he bought property on Euclid Avenue and East 73rd Street. He wanted to be out in the country. Today, of course, the house is no longer there, but if you go to the McDonald's restaurant on the property, you're probably going up Thomas Howard's driveway, and it's just a little bit west of the clinic. What's interesting, we talked about the one lot being 6 acres. The lots on the south side of the street went from Euclid to Carnegie. And there are several pass-throughs through the clinic, and it's fun, and I do it all the time, walking that distance, and you get an idea of how big these lots were. And of course, in 1885, with no cars, they all had horses, and in some cases, cows and chickens. Eventually, they outlawed the cows because now it was getting sophisticated, and there was one family that would sneak their cow into the barn. They had a farm out in Hunting Valley, and they would bring the cow in at night, and they would muzzle it so it couldn't move, and they would sneak it into the barn. And the neighbors would find out about it and didn't like it, but they did this year after year because they wanted the milk and all the products that were made from the cow. But Euclid Avenue was, the lots were big enough to support horses. Thomas Howard basically built a wonderful home, and he had 7 children, 4 boys and 3 girls. And we have an instant to show about parenting where early on, his youngest, Walter, we call him Little Snot-Nose because he was probably 8 or 9 years old. And he noticed that his 2 older brothers were playing with sailboats in a pond that was on the property. And he very quickly figured out that as the youngest, he didn't have his own boat. And so he thought it would be no problem to go to his father and ask for a boat. Now, Thomas Howard was a wonderful man. He was religious, he was charitable, he believed in reputation and honor being the keymost in life, that you do nothing to jeopardize your reputation or your honor. Any product that you build had to be perfect. And therefore, we see the white sewing machine evolving into this beautiful cabinetry and a beautiful machine that was also very functional. And he wanted to pass this along to his boys in some fashion. He was also a man that was very carefully chosen all the words that he used. And he was such that everything was so well thought out that you listened. And you probably met somebody like this, that you wait for them to say something because you know it's going to be a gem, that's going to be something that's well thought out. That was Thomas Howard White. Now, Walter walks up as the youngest of 7 and said, "Dad, have you thought about buying me a boat?" We just said Thomas Howard was very economical with words, and in this case, he didn't miss a beat. He said no. Now, Walter, being the youngest, was a little miffed, and I had 4, and you may have had this experience. You know, by the time the last one comes along, you're so exhausted that he or she gets away with murder. And the older ones always complain, you know, "Dad, I couldn't do that when he was his age." and you say, just go away, I'm tired. Let me get you through college and then go out and find your way, and we can relax. So that was Walter, being the youngest of 7. Well, Walter walked away a little miffed. He came back a few minutes later, and he had an answer for his father. He said, Dad, since you won't buy me my own boat, I'm going to build a boat. Now, if you're going to teach your children independence and self-reliance, isn't that the perfect answer? Coming from an 8-year-old. But I think Thomas Howard's answer is even more precious. He said, son, since you're going to build your own boat, I'm going to buy you a wonderful set of tools. Isn't that a marvelous circle of parenting to make your children? Little Walter eventually became the president of the White Motor Company in 1921 and built a fabulous estate. You would know it today as Hawken High School, a Circle W estate, 1,400 acres, one of the best estates in the country. Many years later, Thomas Howard had some of the finest horses in the world. They were trotters. Everybody on Euclid Avenue had trotters. We had world champions because they knew how to breed and so on. And of course, if you've been to the Racino, the roots of that racetrack are back to Euclid Avenue, which many people are unaware of. And Euclid Avenue had a tradition from 1875 to 1905, the Euclid Avenue sleigh races, which nobody knows about. Now keep in mind the people that lived on Euclid Avenue were celebrities. And the public just wanted a glimpse. Rockefeller going to church was a big event, just to get a glimpse of this great man. And the sleigh races allowed you to see your heroes at play, or at least celebrities at play. And it went on for 6 weeks after the holidays, every afternoon, 4 days a week. And as many as 40 sleighs would congregate around East 40th Street, and they'd race all the way to East 9th, 2 or 3 at a time. The sleighs were cutters, pulled by trotters. Bells, plumes, silver tack, fur coats. Absolutely a beautiful event. And thousands of people lined that corridor from East 40th all the way to East 9th to watch their heroes at play. And when they were done with the race, they'd circle back and race again, all trying to prove they had the best horse. Rockefeller and his brother William raced in the Euclid Avenue sleigh races, and nowhere in history do you read about this for many years. Rockefeller was a great lover of horses. So Thomas Howard had horses capable of racing, and it was time for his boys to have access to those horses. And he called them all in, and he said, basically, you can have use of these horses anytime you want, day or night. But if I ever see you not taking care of those horses, if you do not do everything that's required, you'll lose them for life. And the point was that reputation and honor cannot be tarnished. Once you tarnish that, you never put it back together. It's like Humpty Dumpty. You can pick up all the pieces and glue them back together, but you still have cracks. You never replicate. And so he was pretty severe, and I would think in parenting today, you'd say, my, that's incredibly severe. Today it's quite a bit different in parenting. If you're a grandparent like me, you may have incurred this thing called a timeout. My son gives my grandson a timeout when he's bad. My grandson takes his little computer and he goes in the corner and he has a wonderful time. And then he comes back a few minutes later and he said, Dad, I'm sorry, I'll never do it again. 2 hours later, he's back in the corner, another timeout, having another wonderful time. The point of the story is there were no timeouts in Thomas Howard's world. It was for life. Later on, when Walter became the president, this little snot-nose of the White Motor Company, giving a speech to his 4,000 employees in 1921. And when he looked out, he saw a father working next to his son, working next to his son, 3 generations. And it wasn't one, it was many, many families dedicated to the White Motor Company. And what he said is, my name is on the car, but every car has to be perfect. And therefore, your honor goes into building this car, and every part has to be perfect. And then Walter White said, because our cars will be guaranteed for 100,000 miles. Walter White, 1921. I don't mean to pick on General Motors, but they just came out with their 100,000-mile guarantee 5 years ago. Do they not read history? What Walter was saying is that his car would last a lifetime. You can imagine you would never put 100,000 miles on a car. The cars were brought back to the White Motor Company annually. They were totally refurbished and back out in the field to keep them perfect. What service we'd love today. The chauffeurs early on would bring the cars, later on individuals. But that was a sign of the times. Now, let's give you a contrast in parenting. End result was somewhat similar. Created a great individual, An individual we didn't always agree with, but a great individual nonetheless. John D. Rockefeller. John D. Rockefeller, again, if you want to drive by, lived on the corner of Euclid and East 40th Street, on the south side of the street. He had one of the smallest mansions on Euclid, as he pretended not to be pretentious. He also had a great estate known as Forest Hills, which was in East Cleveland and Cleveland Heights, and was over 500 acres and one of the premier estates in the country. Many of those postcards had the picture of the great house at the estate on the front, and of course advertising on the back. His gatekeeper, Pat Lynch, became famous because oftentimes the gatehouse was part of a postcard. And he did nothing more than open and close the gates, and he became world famous for doing that for Rockefeller. Now, Rockefeller's mother, Eliza, was a Baptist, very strict. Church was all day on Sunday, or most of the day. Through that religion, you couldn't drink, you couldn't smoke, you couldn't even go to a dance. Dancing was offensive. You couldn't even play golf on Sunday, which would have been tough for me. But she taught him frugality, and she taught him to be disciplined, and she taught him to have goals, and she taught him to work hard. So those are all marvelous, but what about his father, William Avery Rockefeller? Quite a contrast. William Avery met Eliza because he was a shyster. He basically was a guy that was a medicine man, sold potions, and all under false pretenses. He was a horse thief, and if that weren't enough, he was a bigamist. Had a separate family. So you wonder, well, what could John D. Rockefeller possibly learn from his father? The father, when he married Eliza, you might wonder, well, how could opposites like that attract each other? How could that possibly take place? Well, William Avery went to the farmhouse of Eliza's parents, who were not rich, but had a nice farm, and he was begging, and he pretended he was both deaf and dumb. And the farmer's about to give him some money, and he spotted Eliza inside, and he began to flirt a little bit. And Eliza said to her sister, boy, if that fellow was not deaf and dumb, I'd like to marry him. William Avery came back, and now he was no longer deaf and dumb. So that's how opposites get together. William Avery basically was, we think, chased out of New York because he was accused of rape, of all things. And again, you don't read this much about Rockefeller's family. And he migrated to live with his sister, who lived in Strongsville, Ohio, and eventually the Rockefellers migrated to Parma, Ohio. But William Avery did teach Rockefeller a number of things. He taught him a lot about business. He made a lot of money doing, of course, false things to people. But what was interesting is the little potion that he sold was petroleum. It was found floating on the streams in New York. Little did we suspect the irony of history that Rockefeller would later make his fortune with petroleum early on. Petroleum was supposed to cure everything from cancer to a thumbnail, and none of it, of course, was true. William Avery also dressed impeccably and also loved fine horses. Rockefeller did that the rest of his life, the best horses, and he dressed impeccably. In fact, in his 90th birthday, he had a brand new suit made, and he had a lot of different things done, and historians said, what do they think? He was going to live forever? For his 90th birthday, a new suit. Well, at any rate, William Avery also believed in education. And at one point, he took John D. and his younger brother, William, and he brought him to Cleveland and put him in the first and best high school in the land. And it was known as Central High School. It was on the corner of East 9th and Euclid. And it was a frame building, eventually became a much bigger high school. In our lifetime, Central High School was still around. The best high school in the United States, right here. Rockefeller went to high school, left before graduation, and went to Folsom School, which was located on Public Square, to take up bookkeeping and accounting, because he knew he needed that to be successful in business. He met his future wife, Laura Spellman, at high school. They were not immediately high school sweethearts. Rockefeller never did anything quickly, and eventually married her at age 25. And they went to a honeymoon in Niagara Falls, a traditional honeymoon. It's interesting to note that John D. Rockefeller's personality was very stern. He was always well thought out. He was like Thomas Howard, didn't waste words. But once he set his mind to something, it was like a steel trap. He was the most disciplined individual that you'd ever want to read about. But when he fell in love with SETI, the workers all commented that the boss's personality changed and he must be in love. So that's quite a potion to take a guy like this, and he could not disguise the fact that he was in love. And they had a wonderful marriage, and SETI lived till 1915, died in her 70s, and Rockefeller lived till 1937. He died just short of his 98th birthday. And I think the thing of the story is that most people don't give Cleveland credit for this being Rockefeller's home. When Seti died, she died in New York. Rockefeller basically had a tax problem here in Cleveland, and many people thought he left Cleveland because he hated it. He did not. He went to New York because of business. They summered at Forest Hills until Seti died, until 1915. Many people said Rockefeller left Cleveland before that. No, he did not. He had 4 homes, and they rotated every 3 months. So the Forest Hills estate was a summer home, and Rockefeller used to hike and bicycle and do all those wonderful things on the estate. When Seti died in New York, Rockefeller had a subpoena because of a tax issue, which he eventually beat, and it was unjust. And his son, he had one son, Junior, John D. Rockefeller II, was kind of annoyed with his father and respectfully said, you know, Father, don't we think we should bury Mother? Now, she's kind of on cold storage up there in New York in a kind of a solarium type situation. And John D. said, no, son, Mother and I will be buried in Cleveland, Ohio, our home. And so if you go to Forest Hills, as I'm sure many of you had, you've seen the Rockefeller Monument, only exceeded, of course, by the Garfield. And his son, Junior, put that oblique together that you may see. And how they got it up there is mind-boggling as you look at it, but they all figured it out. So we're trying, of course, I think, to basically promote Rockefeller. Now, Rockefeller was accused of all kinds of things, and some were true, much was not. But when you look at a man like that, in my opinion, do you say, did he do more good than bad in his lifetime? Rockefeller was the first billionaire, and he gave away over $500 million to charity. Just looking at that alone and some of the phenomenal things that he did and later Junior did with the Rockefeller money, I think we can conclude strongly that Rockefeller did much more good than some of the bad things that he's accused of. And some of the things that he was accused of, those aren't true at all. But there was a dichotomy there, kind of a disconnect between being very religious and some of the things that he did in business. But he always had a reason for doing it, and that didn't excuse some of the behavior. But it wasn't nearly as bad, in my opinion, as some people would like to accuse him of. Now, several months ago, I was asked to give a talk to the Salvation Army. They were going to award some 400 volunteers, and I'm a fan of the Salvation Army. I always wondered, how do they divide up their duties? You see this poor person out in the snow, freezing to death, and then another one inside the mall with a beautiful. And I guess there must be seniority. You must work your way up to that way. But they said, Dan, we'd like you to do the history of charity in Cleveland. And it's numerous. The United Way was founded here in Cleveland. Our Cleveland Foundation is the largest foundation in the country. And I can go on and on and on. But we have great genes in terms of charity. And I said I'd be glad to. And they said, well, in your talk, could you define charity? Now, I can study history and I can put that into a talk, but how do you define charity? And I said I would, and then I said, well, why did I do that? How do you define charity? What I have to tell you, of course, is that Cleveland, Ohio, and I would bet $1 million that every one of you in this room has a charitable endeavor. Every one of you. But what you didn't know, or maybe you didn't know, is that Cleveland, Ohio, per capita, is the most charitable city in the country, per capita. And that's appeared in many things. I'm a believer because I talked in front of many charitable organizations, hundreds of them that I didn't know about, little organizations all raising money for various charitable endeavors. And I call it a subculture out there. If I wasn't a speaker, I'd never know about this, as most of us don't. But I would say thousands of these people that raise money, for anywhere from $5,000 to $100,000 for marvelous charitable endeavors. So when I read that, I wasn't surprised about Cleveland. And I think when you incur a negative stereotype, it'd be good to remind somebody, not that we want to toot our own horn, but the fact that we are known as the most charitable in the country. And now, of course, I got to go to work. I got to find a definition for charity. I mean, where do you look? How do you start and still make it meaningful? And I found, when I do research, you find answers in the most unusual fashion. And the Cleveland Clinic, as I said, owns 2 of the 4 mansions, and I did the history of both mansions. And I thought, well as I was doing that, I might study the history of the Cleveland Clinic. How did this come into being? And it was founded by 4 doctors. You hear about Dr. Cryle, but you don't hear about the others. My favorite was Dr. John Phillips. And maybe you were unaware that the Cleveland Clinic had a horrific fire in 1929 that killed 140 people. And they didn't burn to death. They had X-ray film that was stored in the basement, and a light bulb caused it to be caught on fire. And so these people all smothered to death. And they treated them all day, including Dr. John Phillips, patient after patient, which they could not save. Dr. John Phillips went home that night, and he died of asphyxiation. So he was the only of the founders that gave his life for the clinic. Now, the irony of history is that now we're going into the Great Depression. The fire should have been enough to put the clinic out of business. Surely the Great Depression should have put it out of business. And obviously they had something going that didn't allow that to happen. Today our clinic is recognized, along with many of our other hospitals, as the most renowned hospitals in the world. Again, a tribute to Cleveland's greatness. But oddly enough, Dr. John Phillips in his bio had a saying, and that saying gave me my definition for charity, oddly enough. And what he said was that every patient coming to our clinic will feel the touch of human kindness. And when I read that, I said, isn't that the perfect definition for charity? And if you couple that with Cleveland being the most charitable city in all the United States, and someone says something horrifically negative, would that not be a nice comeback? Now, Dr. John Phillips had a fairly short career. And I also, when I read that, I began to think about it. And I thought, and I don't know why you went in this direction, but I thought, our bodies are all finite. And I took our heart, for example. Our heart is programmed, whether we like to admit it or not, with so many beats. Now, we can watch our diet, we can exercise, we can watch our cholesterol, but when it's all said and done, somebody upstairs knows that when you hit that beat, you're all done. It's over. And yet, let's think about this touch of human kindness, which we're all programmed with. We were not programmed with any limitations, like our heart. You can use it as often or as little as you'd like. And I chose not to define it. We all know when we extend a touch of human kindness. I think if I was going to give the premier example, unlike Dr. John Phillips, he understood the healing power of the touch of human kindness. Charity, of course, has healing power, I believe. And I think we all had the experience when we were sick and young, or most of us had that, where your mother would come in and put her hand on your forehead and assure us that everything would be correct. The ultimate touch of human kindness. So again, when you put that phraseology together to define our Cleveland, Ohio, and I'm not saying Cleveland is perfect by anybody's stretch of the imagination, but what a wonderful response to a negative stereotype. And we'll continue, and Cleveland is on the grow. We will become, again, maybe not the greatest in the world, but we're moving in a wonderful, wonderful direction. And it's great to be around. I think we all know and we appreciate Cleveland. I gave a talk to the Cleveland Clinic last week. Jane and I, my wife, went to a lunch of about 100 women. And I was reluctant to use this phrase, and I thought, what the heck, I'll just use it. And what I heard at the clinic is they bring in doctors from all over the country, and from Chicago and New York and so on. And I said, what I know is that the wives come in kicking and screaming to Cleveland. And I got a laugh out of it. And many came up afterwards and said, Dan, that was good. I was one of those wives that came in kicking and screaming. And why did I not know about Cleveland? Why did I have such a negative image? Because when I got here, we love it. The doctor and I love it. And we probably are going to retire here. What a wonderful, wonderful place to raise our children. And they said, continue to use that phrase because it's accurate, literally. And of course, if a husband's getting a new job, he's got his own problems. And to have a wife come along that's not happy compounds the situation. And I would like my doctor to concentrate, by the way. not to be worried that his little woman at home is not happy here in Cleveland. And I have interviewed several many months later or many years later, and the stories are absolutely true. So we must do a better job of overcoming these stereotypes, and we must do a better job of this image. And there are many groups in Cleveland, Cleveland Now, Global Cleveland, Encore Cleveland, privately held groups that are promoting Cleveland on all kinds of positive fronts. And one of the attractions about Cleveland is our suburbs. I know as a golfer, I'm 20 minutes from 15 golf courses. I started living in Chesterland. I'm 25 minutes from the heart of the city, and I'm in farm country. Most cities can't do that. If you go to Chicago, you drive 2 hours to play golf. I talk to people that go to the theater in Chicago. It's an all-day affair by the time they get to the theater and by the time they get home. They come to Cleveland and say, "Jeepers, Dan, we got dressed. We have the theater in 20 minutes. We had 100 restaurants within a half hour of the theater or of Severance Hall. What a magnificent thing you have here." And yet so few are aware. So you've been a marvelous, marvelous audience. I know you're going to go home tonight, and you're probably going to grade me. You're going to talk about this talk, I believe, and you're going to give me high marks or maybe very low marks, depending on your degree of interest. And I thought it only fair, since my audience was going to grade me, that I could grade the audience. And I've come up with very strict criteria that Jane and I will talk about over dinner, and we're going to go to the lemongrass, by the way. So you'll be the topic of conversation. And it's only fair that, of course, you know the criteria. And the first one is that coughing, and you did very little coughing tonight. So you received very high marks. No cell phones went off. And again, you're building your way into the Hall of Fame of audiences. And lastly, to my knowledge, nobody got up and went to the bathroom. And so you have straight A's. And Jane and I, as we sit for our dinner tonight, will be talking about this wonderful, wonderful experience in your wonderful, wonderful library. I do have 6 stories, and I would love to come back and tell you more. I have written a book, as was announced. I have my own charity, and I can't promote charity. And through our Willoughby Rotary, we buy iPads for children with autism. And we've raised $25,000 over the last couple of years, and we're giving away 55 iPads at a lunch next month. One of the things that's fascinating to me is the national organization, Autism Speaks, gave away 30 iPads last year. And this little Rotary of ours is going to give away 55. Last year we gave away 35, and we hope to improve that one iPad at a time. iPads and these autistic children are miracles, and I have great empathy for those parents. Our children grow up and they go away from house. Hopefully some of them come back. But when your child has autism, you're a parent for life. You have to financially plan, and you have to do all these things. And as we get older, we tend to have less patience, and yet these parents have to have the utmost patience. So I knew I couldn't be involved in curing it, but I knew that the iPad was a great benefit not only to the student and to the parent. And it concerned me that these children could get some training and hopefully be employable. And if you weren't aware, 1 in 58 babies of males have autism today. It's an epidemic by anybody's definition. Polio was 1 in several thousand, several hundred thousand. So it's an unknown fact about autism. Female birth is about 1 in 100. Any lady that's pregnant today, I think, would have concern. And the problem is they can't diagnose it for 3 or 4 years sometimes. But I've heard marvelous stories, and I tell you, I have great admiration for mothers. In fact, I dedicated my book to parents. I've heard stories where a mother says, "My child will be normal or close to normal." And when a mother sets her mind to something, the results are amazing, absolutely amazing, in terms of what they can accomplish with their children. And they don't take no for an answer. I would love every one of those to be working for me. Because they absolutely will do everything possible to make that child successful. And I have great, great admiration. Again, you've been marvelous, and with that, I thank you so very much.
Dan, thank you so much.
Thank you.
In addition to enjoying planning programs love being in when the program's actually happening, because I always learn wonderful things, and this was really fascinating. I am a big fan of Don Maddie, and it was so fun to hear you talk about even kind of more grandeur right here in Cleveland and what was happening over in Britain during that time. And you had so many wonderful details about Millionaires Row and what was happening in Cleveland. That was great. I just loved it. Dan does have books and videos for sale over there, and he's going to be here. You'll be here for a few more minutes.
Yes, we have.
Do you want to do a few questions and answers?
We could, and if you'd let people know, we have marvelous pictures in the back. Some of you didn't see them, and we'll keep them up because now you can put names to faces.
Yeah, I'll turn the lights on back there, and you can go look at those.
Yes.
I had heard years ago that Rockefeller wanted to donate a large sum of money to Case, but ended up giving it to the University of Chicago. Do you know anything about this?
Well, what you find in folklore, and the question was Rockefeller was going to donate a lot of money to Case, and it was turned down. Back then you had Case and you had Western Reserve. They were obviously independent. What we do know is that there was a fellow by the name of Samuel Mather who supported Western Reserve University. If you go on campus, you'll see Flora Stone Mather all over the place. She was part of the creator of the Women's College, Flora Stone Mather College. And she died of breast cancer in 1910. The Mather Mansion is still part of Cleveland State. She never moved in, and his daughter became the mistress of the house for entertaining. But there was a rivalry between Mather and Rockefeller. And Rockefeller, at one point, it was said, wanted to donate his estate to the university, and Mather would have none of it. Now, Mather was also, when Rockefeller left Ohio, was the wealthiest man in the state. So he had great clout. And he did a lot of what he did as far as buildings and so on, and dedication to his wife. Okay, there also may have been some conflict of case, but that story that specific money went to another university is, from my knowledge, not true. He did create Rockefeller University up in New York, and that was to find cures for diseases with children. What many aren't aware of, that he had a little daughter, Alice, that died at age 2 years old from a childhood disease. Also, some people say, well, he took the money to Chicago and did that university. Not true totally. He basically was a Baptist, and there were some Baptist ministers that talked him into doing it, and they kept asking for more and more money. He got rather frustrated at the end. But folklore generally has a thread of truth, but oftentimes through the years it gets greatly exaggerated. And so, you know, when I went to school, a lot of people painted Rockefeller as this horrible person, absolutely non-productive. What he did was cruel and unusual. When you study the time frame, and when you talk about somebody, you put it in today's history versus what they were living, you don't do it justice, because life back then was different. Yeah, he controlled the oil industry, but they were going up and down every recession. The prices would fluctuate. He stabilized it. Those that went into business with him became millionaires. Those that didn't became very angry. And so they berated Rockefeller. Yes, ma'am.
I was going to say, he also donated money to Spelman College in the South, the black college in the South, and that's why that college was named after his wife's family, the Spelmans.
Very accurate, and he was a great supporter during the Underground Railroad. He gave money. He did not serve in the Civil War because his dad was gone, being a bigamist. He had a supportive family. So, but he gave money to soldiers. They'd walk in and he'd take money from his safe. But he was a big supporter early on of the Underground Railroad. And indeed, you're correct. That was quite a university, and honored his wife's family as a result of it. Yes.
So he donated the Rockefeller building Case.
Correct. Yeah, there were some donations that were accepted. Early on, they went after a donation from Junior for the Severance Hall. And he wasn't anxious because, of course, dancing and music was kind of arbitrary in the Rockefeller family. But eventually he did. And he also donated into one of the playhouses. I believe the Cleveland Playhouse, possibly. So Rockefeller's kind of evolved. You know. Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned Barrymore. John Barrymore gave his final performance of Hamlet, the touring performance, in Cleveland. At the Hannah Theater. And they stayed, I think, was there a Halloran Hotel?
Holland Inn Hotel, yes.
They stayed there,
Yeah.
and it was a terrible storm that night. But they had a tremendous, curtain calls, dozen curtain calls. It was very.
See, I lured my best stories from my audience. Now I'm so glad I gave you a high grade. Yes, ma'am.
Do you know what the status is of the Stager Beckwith mansion?
The size?
Well, what's going on?
Oh, I'm hearing, last I heard, it's going to be turned into some kind of museum.
Children's museum.
Yeah, and we're hoping that'll go forward. What's going to happen to the Beckwith mansion? It's one of the four that are left. It's the oldest of the four. Beckwith, we think, was built after the Civil War. The Mather is still left, part of Cleveland State, built in 1910. The Drury, which is across from the Playhouse, built in 1910. Those were the last two built. And then there's a White mansion, no relation to White Motors or White Sewing Machine, built on about East 93rd Street, owned by the clinic. It's probably the smallest one that's left, but I'm very anxious that we preserve. I watch Cleveland State, and they talk about various things. And I think there's enough clout in Cleveland today where tearing those down would be horrific, and I don't think that'll happen.
Where is Beckwith?
Beckwith is about, what would it be, about East 35th, yeah.
Oh, okay.
The old University Club, yeah.
Oh, got it.
You had to be a college graduate to belong, kind of thing. Yeah, Steiger Beckwith. Steiger early on was a partner, I think, with Jebba Wade, and he founded Western Union. One of the neat things you may be aware, if you go to University Circle, to our new remodeled art museum and the marvelous things that they're doing, all that land was owned by Jebba Wade. That was his private park. And he had animals and so on. He donated that. And that created University Circle, including the lake. And there used to be that big fountain in the lake, which I remember as a kid. And you could ice skate and take boats in the lake early on. And the Women's Garden Club renovated all that. But of course, today our art museum, I think, by many definitions, maybe the greatest or very close to the greatest in all the land. And some of the marvelous things that they're doing.
What airstrip did Lindbergh land on in River Road?
It was owned by the Ingalls family. David Ingalls was the only World War I flying ace. He went to Yale, I believe, and he took his plane. They had a club at college, and they had planes. This is really early on. And he went into the war, and then he became assistant secretary to the Navy and worked on developing aircraft carriers. And today, there's a new split rail fence that somebody put in, and it outlines the airfield. So if you're ever driving that route, you can see it. His son later on landed a Learjet on that airfield. And Ingalls became quite famous. He was a good athlete, a polo player, a tennis player, and was assistant to the Secretary of the Navy, I think, on 2 occasions. And when you see the first aircraft carriers, they built the landing platform out of railroad ties. So it was quite something. But Ingalls is very well known, and there's been a couple articles recently about the Ingalls. And his son, I think, recently died of cancer. So, but their home is still there in Hunting Valley. Well, yes, and someone told me that story. I believe it. So that was quite something. And I get a lot of that, and I love every minute of it, where someone comes up and says, "My uncle," or many worked on the Rockefeller estate. I get the stories. My aunt or my great-grandfather was Rockefeller's chauffeur, or we worked on the estate, or a member of my family married into Millionaires Row, which is equally as fascinating. So, and that's why this history is so important today. We're still be able to touch it. We still have a link, a human link, a little removed, but we still have it. That's going to evaporate over the next 10 years. And so part of my mission is, of course, keep this history alive and of course, use it for purpose to promote Cleveland. Yes?
When were the final years of the Millionaires Row? I mean, why did everybody just leave, or what?
Yeah, it's a good question, the final years of Millionaires Row. The problem was that Euclid Avenue was destroyed by the very people that built it, because they had their offices and their buildings on Euclid Avenue. And commercial, so it started changing into commercial entities. Now the relatives inherit these mansions, which are dinosaurs, and they were works of art by anybody's definition, and they can't pay the taxes because the taxes are all commercial. It's better to tear them down and sell the land. The land was, per foot, was some of the most expensive land in Cleveland. And so several people, including Charles Brush and Rockefeller and Hanna, had in their wills that their mansions be torn down. And it was not that they were afraid another family would live in it, but the homes were becoming, like the Mather Mansion was the AAA for a while, you may remember. They were becoming schools, and they were becoming funeral homes, and they were used for offices, and these men did not want their homes to be used. So the very men that built Euclid Avenue, and one of the things that's so fascinating, unlike Downton Abbey, which is a generational entity, is that Euclid Avenue was 4 generations and it was all done. You know, you go after the Civil War, basically, 1865, by 1929, so many of the mansions were torn down. I think by 1935, we only had 14 left. And so it's fascinating to me that all this greatness happened so quickly and the great things they did in such a short period of time, and it really contrasts us against Europe. But when you watch Downton Abbey, you notice that it's American money funding Downton Abbey. And the reason for that was that even some of the millionaires on Millionaires Row wanted their daughters to have title. And they knew those guys had title but no money, and these guys had money and wanted title. So it was the perfect marriage. And Downton Abbey's been very clear. That's historically very accurate, that the wife's family brought in the money to sustain that. But Europe did have that on us. Downton Abbey served another purpose. There were many Americans, including the Whites. Walter, as I said, had a 1,400-acre farm, and his brother Windsor had a 1,000-acre farm in Honey Valley. They wanted to emulate Downton Abbey, more or less. They loved the European style. And, of course, our hunt club was formed, and they, of course, had fox hunts and polo and hunting, pheasant hunting and boar hunting, all those things you see in Downton Abbey, these Americans were trying to emulate. In fact, Windsor White was so enthralled with Europe and this estate that he had all his suits made in Great Britain. And more importantly, his brother Clarence used to tease him that, Windsor, you must think you're related to royalty because of all the things you do. He also founded the hunt club and had the hunt. The hunt to me is hilarious. I respect it, but by and large, they wear white pants and red coats and they go splashing in the mud, chasing this little fox.
Well, he definitely had the name.
Yes,
Windsor.
Windsor.
Yeah.
Well, as it turned out, his youngest sister did a genealogy. And indeed, he was related to royalty. And Clarence teased him the rest of his life. For the person he was related to was Lady Godiva's husband. A little inside baseball. So, again, I know the hours are late for the library, but thank you so much, and the pictures will be up, and we'll have books.